What did you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, look, it is exactly as expected, right? That's going to be the rinse and repeat right up until the general election. Starmer is going to repeat those narratives that I mentioned. I think the striking thing is that, and they've really, I mean, if Sunak is going to have even a remote chance, and we're told that he thinks he's got one, and indeed several people have recently left Downing Street because they were not so convinced about this, they've got to have a counter-narrative. They've got to have a better counter-narrative than either talking about what happened under various Labour programmes that everybody has forgotten because it was so long ago, and quite a big proportion of the electorate weren't even able to vote or were themselves in school when this stuff was going on. And they just need a sharper political rebuttal. Like, what is Sunak's message? Not only about themselves, which, to some extent was always about steadying the ship, fixing things. Well, there's a big problem when things aren't fixed and when things are demonstrably getting worse. But also, what is the Conservative message about Labour? And what is their overarching message that they're going to try and frighten about Labour with the electorate in the run-up to the next general election? I mean, there's obviously all the old tricks about, no money left, they spend all the money. Birmingham, as we were talking about yesterday, that got a mention already. We'll hear lots more about that. But it feels very often as if Sunak, and to some extent maybe this is just a reflection of their political position, which is just starting to increasingly run on fumes, which is they're just sort of scrambling around trying to pick up whatever weapon is around him. And many of these weapons are old and aged and don't really have much impact anymore. They did once, stuff about, we'll hear about coalition of chaos, no money left, all of this stuff. It's like the greatest hits of the last 13 years. But there's nothing new. And they've got to try and find and craft some kind of analysis of what is wrong with Labour and why you can't trust Sunak, and it's not really Starmer, and it's not really there at the moment.
And equally absurd, perhaps, is the attempt to portray themselves as smashing it.
Well, yeah. I mean, again, this reflects again the strategic problem, right? Which is how do you manage to craft a message which at once pays attention and heed and gives credit to the idea that things aren't great in so many different ways, and at the same time try and find an excuse for the fact that has happened despite the fact you've been in office for 13 years. And in a way, the whole Keegan stuff in this schools issue is a really good microcosm for that, right? Because they end up in a position where they end up saying, no, most things are fine, really. Most things are fine. But it ended up looking, the trick with politics is to do that in a really deft way. Yes. And I think, as we've seen time and time again, one of Sunak's problems is that he's not, leaving Keegan to one side, he's not especially deft at crafting that message, and he just so often seems, and I think this is again why the Keegan thing was quite damaging, he seems irritated. We've talked about this before.
Petulant.
He seems peeved.
Yes, I've got the word petulant in my inbox 3 or 4 times in the last 20 minutes.
He always has this slight tone
It's almost how dare you.
Slightly.
Yes.
And I'm sure, look, I think all prime ministers feel like that. They're working all hours God sends. They are
sounding like Gillian Keegan.
They've got a million missiles sort of heading their way every single day. They're trying to bat them away. They're trying in their own heads. They think, I'm working really hard here. I'm doing my best. But of course, that doesn't cut the mustard at all in politics. And he's got to find a way of basically expressing himself better, because in a heat of a general election as well, that is going to become exposed very, very quickly.
Although, as Jason points out, Starmer was actually lacklustre. It was the narrative that won it for him rather than the performance.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I don't think it was a particularly electrifying performance from anybody. But the point is, the sort of macro point is that at least Starmer has got a narrative, indeed, a couple of narratives, and Sunak doesn't. And Labour are already sort of furiously texting around political journalists, including myself, saying that what Sunak said about Starmer not mentioning school buildings in his education speech is in fact incorrect. So they're sending around this transcript which says that Starmer said, so for his Tory party to turn around afterwards and repay their sacrifice with nothing, to sit there twiddling their thumbs as teachers leave in their droves, school buildings start to crumble, and absenteeism goes through the roof, that's shameful. So, there's another little mistake.
It was an odd gambit anyway, I think, to say, yes, there is a massive problem and we are in charge, but you've never mentioned it before.
Yeah, exactly. The building's on fire, but I didn't hear you raising the alarm. Exactly. Again, there's no central message. There's no narrative that cuts through every interview. They've got to get it sorted out.
Very funny. Shall I finish my story?
Yeah, go on.
So there's this
the nation is awaiting.
He's a hideous politician, one of Johnson's sort of henchmen in the early days of his mayoralty, and because the lights have gone off, he thinks that now we'll have the real conversation that we don't bother the public with this sort of stuff. So do you really think that Boris Johnson doesn't know exactly what's going on? And I said, well, no, of course I believed what you told me during the interview. Oh, don't be ridiculous. He knows exactly about closing fire stations and closing. So I looked up at Jones the engineer, who was playing the role of Keith at the time, and I said, we've got all this on tape, have we? We'll play it out after the news. And the bloke exploded. He ran out. He waddled out of the studio at 100 miles an hour. He marched into the production office and said, if you play this, it will be disgraceful. I will have your... And I'm just sitting here going, we'll definitely play it out. We'll definitely play it out. There was never any recording. We don't. The tapes aren't running when we're off as soon as the light. But it was an interesting insight into... Perhaps, as we say, a sense of entitlement that some of these people pursue.
Look, these people have got to remember, I mean, in a way, and this is the counter-argument with Keir, they've got to remember that journalists are not their friends, right?
Well, exactly.
And sometimes...
Well, you say that.
Well, there are lots that are, that's true. But ideally, they're not friends.
Not any names.
And ultimately, this is an antagonistic thing, and, you shouldn't be surprised. Just treat every microphone like a live microphone.